Welcome back to Proverbs. We're going to study Proverbs 5 and the subject, the adulteress. This is where Solomon elaborates on the seventh commandment in Exodus 20 verse 14, thou shalt not commit adultery. Years back, there used to be this columnist, Ann Landers, and Otis of Wisconsin wrote to her about an incident in his life. He said, 11 years ago, I walked out on a 12-year marriage. My wife was a good person. She was under stress. And instead of trying to help her, I had an affair with her best friend. And now Otis is writing about that very bad choice. He said, this is what I gave up, seeing my daughter grow up, the respect of many longtime friends, the enjoyment of living as a family, my wife who was loyal, appreciative, and tried very hard to make me happy. This is what I got. 2 stepchildren who treated me like dirt, a wife who didn't know how to make anything for dinner but reservations, a wife whose only interest in me was how much money she could get, a wife who disparaged my family and ruined all my existing friendships. Finally, the thing I got was a bitter, expensive divorce. Well, Solomon is warning his son about the consequences of such decisions. And again, you remember Solomon is giving us a choice of 2 roads, paths, sometimes he refers to them as, which are lifestyles to travel in this life. You have the road of the wise, you have the road of the fool. And on these 2 roads, in these 2 lifestyles, you have contrasting traveling companions. On the road of the wise, in our case, the contrast to the adulterous woman is the good wife, the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. And then the road of the fool is the adulteress, the seductress, that Solomon is going to elaborate on. So let's look at four insights into ignoring the adulteress in Proverbs chapter 5. Number 1, he says, live by God's wisdom. Chapter 5, verse 1, my son. So there's that grammatical clue that helps us to know that this is a new fatherly admonition, or at least a new main division in that fatherly admonition. My son, attend unto my wisdom and bow your ear unto my understanding. So that's unique. In this fatherly admonition, he refers to my wisdom. Of course, that's the wisdom that God has given him, but he is claiming it as his own. And so what we find in Solomon is, as we have been referring to, there's 3 major fatherly admonitions, but you remember back in chapter 2, in an earlier fatherly admonition, part of it was the warning about the adulteress. This was the 3rd admonition in Proverbs 2, 1-22, the rewards of receiving God's wisdom. If you meet the conditions in 1-4, you'll have the rewards of finding wisdom, which is a right relationship with God and a right relationship with people. And when we have that right relationship with God, he delivers us from the evil man in Proverbs 2:12, and he delivers us from the evil woman, Proverbs 2, verse 16, to deliver you from the strange or the adulterous woman. So that was part of that 3rd admonition, but now he gives chapter 5, what we're going to look at, another fatherly admonition. And then in chapter 6, verses 24-35, he's going to give another fatherly admonition. And each of these has its own uniqueness. Chapter 6, verses 24-35 stresses that when you have this adulterous relationship with another man's wife, he is coming for you. This is Proverbs 6, verse 34. Proverbs 6:34. For jealousy is the rage of a man, therefore he will not spare in the day of vengeance. And then you have this chapter 7, verses 1 to 27, where it's almost like Solomon is videoing this adulteress going after the simpleton, this uninitiated to life youth, and he's videoing it. He's getting audio, and he records that for us. He actually records her in action. But we're going to focus in chapter 5 on these insights to ignore the adulteress. So he says, live by God's wisdom that I am as a parent passing on to you. And then number 2, avoid the adulteress. Verse 3, chapter 5, 3. For the lips of an adulterous woman drop as honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. So here he's emphasizing her destruction. Look in verse 4. But her end is bitter as wormwood. So what he says, first of all, in describing this woman who's headed to destruction, her words are sweet. And he says, as sweet as the honey that drops from the honeycomb. This, ironically, is virgin honey. That is the sweetest. You catch it as it's actually dropping from the honeycomb, coming from someone who is not a virgin. But her words are sweet. Her words are smooth. The second part of the verse says, smoother than oil. She is a smooth talker. And if you turn to that last fatherly admonition in chapter 7, verse 14, he actually gives her smooth words. In verse 14 through verse 20, I have these in quotation marks because this is the temptress tempting. Here's her words. I have peace offerings with me this day. I have paid my bill. I'm a religious person. Therefore came I forth to meet you diligently to seek your face. And I have found you. I have decked my bed with coverings of tapestry, carved works. I have perfumed my bed. Verse 8, come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us solace ourselves with loves. For the good man, her husband, is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a lot of money. My husband's on a business trip. He won't be back. Listen to her smooth words. We can do this. We can get away with this. But we know that is never the case. We know that 3 million files in regard to Epstein have just been released. 3 million. There's a lot of embarrassment in those 3 million files. The ambassador from England to America is on one of these Epstein files, standing in his underwear with a woman. I'm sure she was a smooth talker. But her words are also deadly. Chapter 5, verse 4. But her end is as bitter as wormwood. And verse 5, her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold of hell. That's the word Sheol in the Old Testament. So it says that her words are bitter. There's bitter as wormwood back up in verse 4. They're bitter because they end in death. And so the wormwood there was a plant that was placed between woolen garments to protect from maggots and moth. So again, the irony is that her sins will not keep her from the maggots that eat rotten and decaying corpses. There's some bitter irony here that Solomon is giving to drive home this point to his son. And he uses the word Sheol here at the end of verse 5. Sheol is the Old Testament version of Hades in the New. So you have the righteous and the unrighteous going to Sheol and going to Hades. You have Lazarus in Hades. You have the rich man in Hades. And so, in other words, part of Sheol would be hell, as we think of it, and part would be paradise, until Jesus moved all of paradise into heaven. But that's the end of her life. It ends up in hell because her lifestyle reflects her unsaved condition. She's not going to hell because she commits adultery. This person's going to hell because they have rejected salvation. She brings bitterness. She brings death. But then look in verse 7. Look in verse 7 where you have a change here. Hear me now, therefore, O you children. So before he was talking about her destruction, now he's talking about your destruction, sons, daughters, if you live this lifestyle. And that's why he says, O ye children. So what does he say? If you follow this lifestyle, there will be the loss of respect, verse 7. That's why he says, listen to my wisdom. Verse 9, lest you give honor unto others and your years unto the cruel. There is the loss of respect. You think of David. When you hear somebody's name, immediately thoughts come into our mind. We think of David, we think of the man after God's own heart, but perhaps we think first of his sin of adultery with Bathsheba, his murder of her husband Uriah, his cover-up for 9 months. There is the loss of respect. I've mentioned previously these influential Christian leaders, pastors, preachers, Ravi Zacharias, Philip Yancey, Stephen Lawson. So now when we hear their names, there is no respect. There is a loss of respect. There's a loss of wealth. Verse 10, lest strangers be filled with your wealth. You follow her. This will be the consequence. And your labors be in the house of a stranger when she takes it all in divorce. And her lover now has what you worked for. So you have the loss of money. You have the loss of money in child support. Perhaps you have the loss of money in hush money. But there's a loss of wealth. There's a loss of health sometimes. Verse 11. And you mourn at the last when your flesh and your body are consumed. So what great consequences. J. Vernon McGee told about a guard in a prison in Atlanta, and he said this officer told him of this man who had contracted syphilis and went insane. He became a blundering idiot. And then the officer said to McGee, This man was responsible for the ruin of many a young girl, but he didn't get by. Some girl along the way got even with him. You read the story of Al Capone, the mobster in Chicago, how he contracted syphilis as a young man. But the last 10 years of his life in prison, he had the mentality of a 12-year-old, and he was another one of these men who just talked to himself. He went insane. And so there are physical consequences. There's mental, psychological, emotional, relational, and even physical. And so Solomon is warning his son about this. So the insights are: live by God's wisdom that I am passing on to you, son, daughter. Avoid the adulteress. And then here's the, there's the negative. Here's the positive. Love your wife. In verse 15, Solomon focuses now on the married. Perhaps his son is married. Because look at this. In verses 15 to 23, the focus is on now the married. And this section is like a brief summary of the Song of Solomon. You see the similarity of language in verse 15. Drink waters out of your own cistern and running waters out of your own well. Let your wife be the one who refreshes you. Let your fountains, probably referring to children, be dispersed abroad, and the rivers of waters in the street, let them be only yours. Let your children be from your wife. Verse 18, let your fountains be blessed. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. It really sounds a lot like the Song of Solomon. So I'm gonna click this and go to a post that I wrote on the Song of Solomon. And I just give a big overview of it. I'm taking this overview from Bible Knowledge Commentary, which just takes, who walks through the process of dating, as you see in chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, 7. The bases of dating should be friendship, character, communication, and integrity. Then he goes into discussing the engagement period. He said, this is where you kill the little foxes that spoil the vine. Solve the problems that's going to hinder your marriage. Solve them now before you get married. That's one of the purposes of engagement. Then you have the public wedding ceremony. You have the honeymoon, where he describes her physical beauty 3 times, but each time it becomes even more, and it becomes more intimate. Then you have the first spat, the first argument, and then you have the resolution, the growth of the marriage as you work through those inevitable difficulties. And so what we have here in this section is Solomon just giving a little summary of what he wrote in his love song to his first wife, the wife of his choice. Drink waters out of your own cistern. And then lastly, he says in chapter 5, verses 20 to 23, embrace wisdom. So look again at how he helps us to know he's changing from one subpoint to another. Verse 20, and why will you, my son, be ravished or intoxicated with an adulterous woman, another man's wife, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? So here's this, my son. So we've had these clues all the way through this passage. You have the first one starts with my son. Then he changes subjects. He starts talking specifically about the strange or the adulterous woman. And in verse 15, he changes subjects now from talking to a single to a married. Then he gives us again, he's coming back and saying, son, embrace wisdom, not an adulteress. If you go back to chapter 4, verse 8, he actually says that, verse 8, exalt her. Here he's personifying wisdom as a female, in contrast to the adulteress. So look at verse 8. Exalt her, exalt wisdom, and she shall promote you. She shall bring you to honor when you embrace her. Embrace wisdom. Don't embrace an adulteress. Then he goes on, he just, again, gives warnings about not embracing wisdom. But I want to end on, I would want to end on a positive note, that there is forgiveness. Solomon experienced forgiveness, we believe, and he wrote Ecclesiastes after years of regret. Nevertheless, he had experience. He had forgiveness. David, Solomon's father, confessed his sin in Psalm 51. He wrote of the blessedness of being forgiven in Psalm 32, because the Psalms are not sequentially in order. But there is forgiveness. And that should be the way we end this message. When I was pastoring Needham's Grove Baptist Church, I pastored 15 years. And I was preaching through Proverbs. I was preaching through the 15 fatherly discourses in Proverbs 1 through chapter 9. So I went over these fatherly discourses 3 times. And I remember the last time I was preaching out of chapter 7. It's the 3rd time. Okay? It was pretty difficult. But that was on a Sunday. On Monday, 2 women from 2 of our church members, 2 ladies from our church, came to our house and wanted to talk to me, their pastor. My wife was in the next room, and one of those women was living in adultery. And God used this message to just convict her heart. She was broken. She was repentant. And she was willing to not only confess her sin, but to forsake her sin and forsake her lover. And she did. God forgave her. God restored that marriage. And every once in a while I'm invited to go back, and after not just years, but decades, and she and her husband are still together. So there's hope. We know that all do not respond to the message of forgiveness, but we should offer it. And thank God when that message of forgiveness is responded to.